Okay, welcome back. My talk today is about our robotic DFT scene representation architecture. I'm going to talk about the elementary behaviors that are relevant for scene representation, and I will have a larger example at the end of my talk. So let's have a brief look at the outline of this talk. First of all, I will start with a little introduction to scene representation. Then I will probably fill you in on some of the missing building blocks that we need to understand the scene representation architecture today. Some of those might be already covered by the talks that you already heard, so we might want to skip those. Then we look at the scene representation architecture itself with a special emphasis on autonomy. So how can we make that whole architecture do its tasks in an autonomous fashion? You will, again, will be remembered of those topics that Matt had in his talk about intentions and conditional satisfactions, and so on. And at the end, we have that larger architecture that realizes reaching and grasping movements in a scene, which uses a huge part of that scene representation architecture that you will see today. So, when we talk about representing scenes, we always talk about some internal representation of our environment. So what we store is not only the spatial layout of a scene, so where every relevant object is placed that we might want to grasp or talk about, but also it contains some featural descriptions of those objects. You might want to store, for example, which colors those objects had, the orientation to later pick them up with your hand easily, and so on and so forth. And in our view, this representation of space and feature is the foundation of every higher cognitive operation that comes after that. So you might have seen something of spatial language by Sebastian, maybe. I'm not sure if anyone took that project, but so if you want to answer some questions about a scene, what is the object to the right of the red object, you need some kind of internal representation to apply such operations. And then on the same topic, you also want to have that internal representation to apply any action in the scene. So if you want to pick up the red object, you have to first get that back into your attentional focus, know where it is, know probably its height, its orientation, something like that, and then pick it up. One nice property of that representation should be that it's not only kind of a representation of your current image of a scene, but it's stable across eye movements, and it's even stable across body movements. So I don't want to build up some working memory representation of a scene, and then if I take a step to the left, everything is completely offset. And as you can imagine, it might have some limited capacity. You don't want to store every little detail, not every object in the scene. Some of them might not be relevant for your task. But you don't also want to store a complete image description of the object. You just want to store the stuff that you need to get back to that object. And then you can look at it again and do some other more detailed operations on that. So if you talk about limited capacity, you always have to have some link to working a long-term memory and some clever mechanisms to exchange what you know of a scene in your working memory and your long-term memory. So something like this should be in there as well, but this is not the focus of today's talk. Okay, so if we want to get some inspiration on how to have something like that for a robot, we of course can look at how humans do that. So humans are very good at solving tasks in crowded, cluttered scenes. You don't have any problem in picking up an object on a crowded table or something like that. You can even close your eyes and pick up stuff. So there is something like a scene representation in our heads, but this is not a very kind of aware task that you can execute on the scene. So there is some working memory in your head containing features of objects, but you can't really ask humans about how they do that. Lucky for us, there is already a DFT model of how such spatial memory looks like in humans. This is done by Johnson, Spencer, and Schön in 2008. And we will going to take that basic idea that's in there and apply that to our robotic scenario. And the basic idea is very simple. So the nature of this internal representation is heavily tied to space. So space is a defining feature for an object. And you have several fields that combine one feature dimension with its spatial position. So you might have 2D fields where you have like space here. This would be space. And you have some feature, for example, color over here. And then you can have as many peaks as you want, describing the color of each object in the scene, from something like that. And you don't have you have more than one map, so you can have several of those. You can have like something for like orientation and so on. And all are defined across space, so you have that binding feature space. Everything that is at the same space belongs together. And if you know the space of an object, you can actually completely extract the feature description of that. So you can look up its color, its orientation, and so forth. So this saves you creating a very high-dimensional field where you want to put everything that you know about an object into one field, which actually explodes if you want to do that on a machine. If you want to have like a 10D field, then you can't really do an Euler step anymore in a reasonable amount of time. So in this fashion, you can simply add another feature dimension and save a lot of dimensions in your fields. So this is kind of a decomposition that you have features across space, and space is the binding dimension that keeps all of that together. Okay, so now let's take that core idea and let's look at our robotic context. So we want to apply that basic idea that we have a spatial map of features of objects to something like a shared working space in front of a robot. And we also want to apply it in a kind of an interactive scenario so that the robot can work together with a human that might instruct the robot to pick something up or assemble something that's on the table. So this is kind of the thing that we want to represent, so the 2D space of table in front of us. And then we want to use that representation, the core principle, to do two things. One is to generate any kind of behavior, for example, grasping, picking up objects. But at the same time, we can use that same representation to help the robot to understand any language phrases like this one. For example, if you say, hand me the red screwdriver, you can use this space feature map and look up red and look up something which would be an object label or category, and then put the robot's attention to that object, and the robot knows, okay, we're talking about that red screwdriver that's over there. Maybe I should go there with my hand and pick it up. And you can also do those spatial language phrases, what's to the left of the pliers, getting one in your attention, and then applying something like a left operator to see what's there in your internal representation. Now, we have to have some kind of behaviors that fill that representation, take care of maintaining that representation, and allow us to get back to what we already have stored in there. So we define those three behaviors that are very important. Those are the basic ones that we need. So we have to have some way of exploring a completely unknown environment, which means that we go to each object that we don't know anything about, look at it, store the feature values of that object in our spatial feature map, recognize that we're done with that object. We have that in our internal representation now, and then move on to the next one. So we have that spatial feature map in our internal representation filled with everything that's interesting for us. The second behavior would be, once we have that internal representation, make sure that if something changes in the scene, that our internal representation isn't invalid. So if we look back at an object and someone, for example, a human, took away the object or placed another object at the same position, which has some other featural descriptions, we want to detect that there was some change, and we also want to update our internal representation. So make sure that our working memory of the scene is really the outside world that we're currently perceiving. And the third behavior would be, given any kind of cue, for example, a color, red, or a category, screwdriver, or something else, maybe a combination of cues, the big red object, we want to be able to query our internal representation and refocus our attention on that object. And that might mean that we have to go through several candidates to see which one fits best the feature description that we got, to really say, okay, this is probably the object that we meant. Now, if we have a robot, we have to really deal with several challenges. I mean, having a model of human working memory is fine, but if you really put that on a robot, you have to deal with real sensory input, which you can actually see on top here. So this is an image of a Kinect camera, and you can see that you can't even perceive some portions of the scene because they're behind some objects. You see that there are a lot of holes in here where you can actually don't say anything about the scene. At the same time, you might have a moving sensor, so if the robot moves its head around, this image changes drastically, which doesn't mean that the scene changes. It's just that the image looks completely different. And you have to take care of noticing that it's just your view that changes and not the scene, because you don't want to update anything at all in your representation. You have to also deal with a limited field of view, so you can't at all times see the whole scene, and you might get back to objects that you haven't seen for a while, and then you have to really detect that maybe it's not there anymore, or a change, or something like that. You just can't simplify space to be one-dimensional, so you have to deal at least with a two-dimensional plane, or even better with a 3D space. If something is in the hand of a user, then you can say, okay, it's somewhere above the table. What you also have in those interactive action scenarios with humans, that the scenes are very dynamic. So you don't have a static image of the scene, but you have something where at all times there could be a hand moving an object around. You might have several objects that are moving at the same time. So if you have two hands or the robot moves an object around, you might have objects that disappear and reappear, something like that. So you have to have some mechanism to update your internal representation all the time. Then coming back to what Mattis talked about, we have to take care that if you have those three basic behaviors in memory that were on the last slide, that you have to have some way of switching between those. So having to know, now I'm exploring the scene, okay, now I'm answering to a cue. I have to really make sure that those aren't active at the same time. And it gets even harder if you then do some meaningful operations after, for example, focusing your attention back. If you have a chain of behaviors that make sure that you grasp something, you have to make sure that these are executed in a sequential order and something like that. You, of course, have to deal with computational constraints. So what you see down here is a 3D field. So those are slices over space. Each slice are 2D space coordinates, and each slice represents a specific color. And you can imagine that this is a volume, 3D volume of neural activation, and you can have peaks in there. 3D fields and 4D and so on are very computationally hard to do on a machine, and if you have several of those, as in this example, you have to make care that you have to be efficient in computing the order step and something like that. And there are other constraints that I'm not talking about today. Okay, so now let's have a look at the missing building blocks that we need to understand how we can build a scene representation architecture. So the first part that is currently missing is if we have a camera input and we want to connect that to neural field activation, how would we do that? So how would we tell a robot what's actually interesting to look at in a scene? What is the definition of an object that's interesting, something like that. So what you can do to really link up your camera input to your neural fields is an operation that is called saliency, and there's famous work by Etienne Koch about that, which takes up an input image over here, applies a lot of filtering operations on different feature maps, which look for outstanding features in the image. So for example, if you have an image that is completely blue, but at one point there is a red spot in there, you get a high activation at that point where there is only red, and almost no activation at every other site. And you can think of the same example for orientation. So if you have an image with edges that are all like in this direction, and at one point there's something that's in the other direction, you get high activation at that point and low activation everywhere else. And this is done across a hierarchy of resolutions of images and across several feature channels. And what you then end up with are it's a spatial structure of interesting positions in the image. So if you take this image, you get, for example, high activation here because it's It has a very strong orientation, and it's a very clear color if you compare it to the background. The same is true for orange of this thing here, with clearly defined edges that are completely different to the rest. And you get some slight activation at this thing here, but it's, so the interesting points are those two. And how that is done is, I think everyone already knows that filter operation. So you take, like of the Mexican hat kernel that you've seen in our field interactions, so there's an excitatory part in the middle and two inhibitory parts on the side. And you just go across your image with this. And the thing is that everything that fits in this center region and is not present in the outer region of that filter gets the highest saliency. So this is interesting. This is something that sticks out from the background. And you can imagine that if you go across this image, for most of the parts you just see white. And if it's white in here and white outside, then you get almost no response. But if you go to an object that's blue, and it's only blue in the middle, then that's completely different from the rest. So everything outside of that is not blue. So you get high activation at that point, and you get some clue about that this could be an interesting point to look up later on. One nice thing about this is that you can tune your filter kernel so that it roughly fits the size of the object that you're interested in. I can show you that in a little Cedar demonstration. So what I have here is an input image with some large objects, a cup and some blocks, and a lot of small ones. And I apply the saliency operations on one of the feature channels of that image, but I change the size of the convolution kernel. So in one way, it's a very big one. So the big objects fit into that excitatory region of the kernel, and the other pathway is just a very small kernel. And you can see in the results, so this would be the saliency of the big and the small kernel, that on top here you have kind of high activation on the big objects, so the three big ones in the scene, and the rest is blue, so there's almost no activation. Whereas if you have that small interaction kernel here, you get like high activation for the small objects, which nicely fit into that kernel, and the big ones are a little bit active, but not as active as the small objects. So you can, in some way, design your kernels that they fit roughly to the object shape. And of course, you can then put this map into a field and let it do detection decisions on the saliency so that you end up with a representation of which locations in the image are relevant for your robot. Okay, so this would be our first building block, that we have some way of coupling camera input to our neural field. The second one, I think Sebastian talked about this a lot in this morning. It's combining what we know about a spatial position and a feature description in a field that is a higher dimensional than the first inputs. So I will leave that out now to go into details. Maybe I will just show you how that looks like in 3D. So you get kind of the grasp on that. Once again, this here. So you already know that rich concept, so that you have 1D inputs along just one feature or one spatial dimensions, which create those ridges in 2D space. And then if you put them into a 2D representation, you get those subthreshold pre-shapes in here. And if you then boost such a 2D field, you get a peak at the position where they cross, which looks like this. So you get a peak at exactly the right spatial position and the feature description of an object. If you do that in 3D, then it looks almost the same. But once again, this is the strange plot with slices. So you get a 2D position that you want to assign to your 1D feature value. So you see that there is subthreshold activation in each slice, so it's always at the same spatial position across the feature metric, which is the slices. And there is some whole slice activation coming from that 1D feature value, which is roughly sitting at this value and then Gaussian shape to the sides. And if you do the same as in the 2D case, if you just boost the field so that it can go through a detection decision, you get a peak actually at the same spatial position and feature value that you've given in as inputs. And you will see that later on in the architecture as well, that this is done that way. Okay, so we've covered that. Matt has also covered the basics on autonomy of behaviors. So we have that little ECU setup where you have an intention node that might boost some fields, just as you have seen in this little example, that you can boost the field to build up a peak at a given ridge crossing. And of course, monitoring some other site in your architecture that triggers the condition of satisfaction if your behavior has reached the intended goal. So I just want to remind you that we have to find some clever goal for the 3 behaviors that I've mentioned earlier: exploration, maintenance, and query, to really trigger that condition of satisfaction to go on to the next one. So we'll come back to that when we look at the architecture. And the last building block, which is very important for our autonomy, is change detection in fields. This is done with such a setup. So you have 3 fields where one of them gives you some current estimate of, for example, what you're looking at. So this could, for example, be a color of the object that is in your attentional focus, and that's at some specific color. And you have some expectation of what you're expecting at that position, which is done in this field here. So you have, for example, the same estimation, the expectation as in your input. And then you combine those 2 activation peaks in a third field, which we call the change detection field. But one of them is excitatory and the one is inhibitory. And what you can have is that your expectation matches your current input. So the inhibitory input cancels out the peak at that position, right? So you won't get a peak because this one drags the field below threshold and this one tries to drag it above, and they cancel each other out. And then you can actually define a little node of like the Murray nodes that you've seen in your first exercise yesterday, detecting that if you sum up over the whole field that there is no activation above threshold. So you have some way of detecting that your expectation matches your current input. The same is true if you look at an input that is not really matching your expectation, but now the inhibition is somewhere here and the excitatory input is somewhere here, so the change detection field builds up a peak. And then you can have a second node that also looks at the summed up activation. And this one gets active if there is enough activation above threshold. So you can have 2 neurons. One says there's nothing in the field, and one says there is some peak here, which means your expectation doesn't match your input. And we will later see how that is used to trigger some condition of satisfaction signals to go on in a sequence of behaviors. Okay, now we have all our building blocks together to look at the scene representation architecture. I will just briefly go through that. There are more details to that than this, but bear with me. So we start up at the top here with our camera input, and then we have 2 pathways. The first one would be kind of the saliency pathway going down here, which is kind of a 2D spatial representation of interesting things in the scene, which ends up in a selective field down here over those 2D space coordinates that we want to represent, which we would call an attention field. Because this is very selective, it can only pick 1 items of those interesting ones at each time in space, which you can, for example, see here. So there are 4 interesting sites, but only one of them gets a superthreshold peak. There's a second pathway that goes from the camera into some feature extraction, which is influenced by the current attentional focus. So we're only looking at features at that spatial position where we're currently interested at. And then we can, for example, extract the color at that position. And this is apparently the color of that object. We can, of course, apply more feature extraction operations, but in this drawing it's just color. And then what you see here is the same thing that we've seen some slides ago. This is the change detection, so you have some input coming in here and some expectation coming from down here, and then you have the change field here. Those 2 pathways are combined in this field. So this is a space feature map. It's 3D, and you have working memory peaks in there. So this is 1D feature and 2D space, which gets filled up in a sequence, and we will see that in a moment. And for example, for such a scene, it might look at some point in time like this, that you have peaks for a red object, it's a yellow object down here, it's a green object here, a blue object on the top left, and something like that. Which then also goes into a second 3D field, which is selective, where you can actually instantiate a peak representing a single object of your memory, given some queue, for example, in a spatial queue or a feature queue. So you can combine what you know about the scene here and, for example, a color input like blue, and then cross them in this field, boost it, and then you get a peak at an object that is probably blue at a spatial position where that blue object was. Okay, so let's get back to the 3 behaviors. So how does that work if we want to explore a scene? So once again, we have that input, which we, with some saliency operation, transform into input into our attention field, which we then boost to build up a peak. This peak leads also to a feature extraction at that position. Then we have some spatial position where we want to store something, and we have a feature extraction of that position. For example, it's currently down here, yellow, and we put in both this spatial tube-like activation and that slice of feature in that 3-dimensional field. Now we are currently doing this for just one object, so how do we know that we are finished with this? How do we know that we have created a peak in here that really represents that object? So what we do is take our change detection mechanism, and with that second 3D field that you've seen in the architecture, read out the color value at the current attentional focus from our working memory. And we use this as expectation. So we are currently expecting this color to see in our forward stream. We also have the feed-forward extracted feature that we currently see in our camera focus, and we wait until those things overlap. So we wait until we have a peak here at the right feature estimate that represents the same thing that we see in our feed-forward stream, which means that this one would actually be over here, this one would be at that position. We don't get a peak here, so our no change node goes on. We can put this forward to our condition of satisfaction node and turn off the intention to look at that object. So what that does is, turning off the intention of our exploration behavior deboosts that field. In the meantime, that I didn't show that in this thing. In the meantime, we have built up some memory of where we currently looked at. So we have some way of storing that at this position we have looked for some time. So if we take away the attentional boost here, the feature extraction also goes away, that condition of satisfaction node turns off, and that intention node of that behavior of exploration is set up so that it reactivates again. And what happens now is the attention field again gets a boost, but there is some inhibition coming from that spatial working memory. So we have looked at that position that we have investigated in the last run for some time. So we will pick up the next object, because the saliency of the object that we've stored recently is decreased by that spatial working memory. So we go to the next object, and the same cycle repeats. So we go again through feature extraction, combine it over here, put it into the change detection system, wait until we have a peak in here that matches our feature feed-forward extraction, and then go on to the next one, deboosting and boosting that attention field. I'm going to show you that in a little demo of a video of our architecture running. Let's see. So what you see here is on the top left you see the camera input. It's not very clearly visible on that beamer. So there's a yellow object here, there's a red object here, and a blue object here. You see them working in the space color working memory down here, which currently has no peak at all. This is the change detection over color. And this is a very convenient, simply read out of that working memory. So it's just color over space in an image. It's the same as here, but it's easier to see which color the peaks represent in that image. So what happens now is that there is some attention focusing on the red object, I guess, which extracts the spatial position and this slice of activation representing the feature value red. You see that there is some activation peak right at the border because red is kind of at the borders of that color space. And after some time, it switches over to the next one because the estimate that I'm expecting to see red is in this working memory, and it matches the feed-forward feature red. So this change detection field gets inhibited at that point. The node change node goes on and signals the behavior that it can go on to the next item. So now another item was picked, which is probably the blue one. So once again, you see that there is an attentional spatial input here, and you see that some slices of that 3D field are activated by the color blue. Currently, there's not yet a working memory peak in here, so we just read out the forward color. And at one point, we got that peak established here, which gives that inhibitory input to that field, and you see that the peak disappears, so the no change node goes on, and it repeats itself for the yellow object. Bam. So after a while, you've gone through all of the items in the scene, and then you see that the internal representation much more or less looks like the scene that you're currently looking at. Okay, I have to read her. I don't get the first word. The shapes.
The shapes. Yeah, because some are circular.
Oh, no. They look circular, but so they look circular because the Gaussian-shaped peaks here are circular. So it doesn't know anything about shapes yet, but you could add that, and you will see that later on that we also do something like that. Okay, so let's talk briefly about maintaining our internal representation. So for one point, we want to make sure that if objects are moved, we don't have to look back at them again to again start extracting features and create our working memory, something like that. So what we did in a variant of our system is to always feed some spatial input into our working memory. And then if objects start moving around, which we actually simulated by putting those colored markers on robots, the spatial input takes care of pulling along those peaks once the spatial position changes. So you get a broad input along space, and if something changes in space, this peak tracks that spatial input. And you can do that for multiple objects at the same time without focusing that object, because that spatial input is available for the whole scene. And then you can kind of track every change without having to look at each object again, extracting the features again, something like that. What you can also do is set up some working memory for spatial positions that aren't currently in your field of view. So what we did here was store a scene and have some working memory representation, which is in a working memory mode for everything that is outside of the current camera image, but is in an input-driven regime, which you can see that the resting level is a little bit lower in this cutout here. This is the current view of the table. So once the camera moves upward, you see that there are some working memory peaks over space, which once again feed into this representation, this working memory representation, and keep those peaks alive. So we still keep that space feature links alive, even if we don't see those images, the images of those objects. But once we go back, you see that one of those objects was removed. So there is no current spatial input coming at that position that could sustain the working memory peak of space and color at that position. So what happens now is that it automatically forgets about that object because there is no current input at that position anymore, whereas the red object still receives input from the camera image, still sustains the space color peak, so we still know that there is a red object after looking back at the scene without having to focus that red object again. What we are also interested in is detecting feature changes. So for example, if someone would have changed that object with, exchanged it with a green car or something like that, how would we notice that? And once again, we can use our change detection field for that. So as you remember, all the time we're comparing what we're expecting to see with what we currently see in the scene. So what I have here now is a working memory of the scene where we've seen a yellow object, like in the first video, but someone exchanged it for a blue object. Now if we refocus onto that object, after a while, if our spatial memory of our looking history decays over time, we get as current input some blue estimate, but we're expecting to see yellow, right? So that you can actually see once it goes to that object. So now what happens here, and you've also already seen the update down here, you're expecting yellow, you're seeing blue, so something isn't right. So the condition of satisfaction doesn't fire, you don't go on to the next object because something has to be done. And what happens now is that this blue is once again put into that 3D working memory field and also creates a peak at that new feature estimate at that position. And through some global inhibition along feature dimensions, we make sure that the old peak that was there representing yellow gets weaker or even pushed out of the field. So you see that it already started to change over to blue. And the readout also switches to blue after a while because we have a peak at blue now. And you see that this inhibition, I'm now expecting blue, kicks in, suppresses the peak in our change field. And now we know, okay, there is no change in the field anymore, so we're seeing the thing that we're expecting. And we can go on to the next one. Yeah. And what I do now is put a yellow marker on top of that blue object again. And you will see once it goes back to that object, which happens right now. Now it's this other way around, so it's expecting blue because it has updated its memory beforehand, but what it actually sees is yellow. And the same mechanism kicks in, starting to write in yellow as a peak, getting the inhibition. So now our expectation matches our current feature input, and we can go on to the next object because now we know our memory is aligned with our scene. Okay. Now the last mechanism would be, the last behavior would be querying the scene representation. So you've seen all the fields in that first drawing, but just to remind you, we have this saliency pathway to attention. We now have also our working memory representation of the scene, and now we are giving some feature cue. For example, look for a blue object. So what we can do now is look in our representation of in our representation to look at every spot that is blue, right? So just highlighting the slice that is blue and then making a selection decision where there are blue objects and feeding that back into our attention field to have some top-down saliency of where blue objects are. We can actually do the same on our bottom-up saliency pathway. I'm not going into detail right now, but you can feed in that blue feature as well in here and get some clue about where blue objects are and forgetting about everything else. And then you can, of course, boost again your attention field, pick one of those candidate objects that are most likely blue, and see if this is the one that you want. So how do you detect that this is the one that you want? Once again, we use our change detection fields, but now instead of inserting our expectation of what we have in our memory, we're inserting our expectation of the feature that we want to have in our attentional focus. And once we have attention on that spot, we of course also get the feed-forward value at that spot, and we might have picked an object that is very salient for some other reasons than color, and now see that it's in fact not blue, but it's yellow or something like that. So we can notify the elementary cognitive unit that makes sure of boosting that attention field that this is not the right object, then firing a kind of a signal to a condition of dissatisfaction, this is not the object that we want, and then going deboosting that attention field. Once again, there is some spatial working memory of where we looked at. So if we repeat that process, once again boosting some region in the attention field, we get most likely another candidate object, which we then again can compare down here until we get to an object that matches our Q description. Okay, so I have like 1 minute left. So we really quickly go through our big project that uses this architecture that I've shown to you today, which is implementing grasping movements to novel objects. So the challenges here are kind of the same as in our scene representation architecture. So you have to have some way of focusing attention to objects that you want to grasp. You want to have some values of featural descriptions of that object to make it possible to grasp it. So for example, estimate the shape of that object or the height or something like that. You have to deal with multiple behaviors. So first you have to really bring an object into the attentional focus and then trigger a chain of behaviors that drive your arm there, close your hand, pick it up, something like that. And you really have to link up your dynamic neural field architectures to arm movement. This is what we did in that project, and I will just flash some slides on how that is done. So first of all, those are the involved behaviors in that architecture. So we have a scene representation part over here. So we mostly use that exploration behavior going through the scene in a sequential fashion, building up a memory representation of the scene. And then we have that query mechanism to, once again, if we have a target object, really focus our attention on that object. Then what's down here, you will hear about in the next talk. This is an object recognition system, but we kind of misused it by not trying to identify an object label, but trying to fit some generic shape templates to what we see in our attentional focus, while at the same time doing a pose estimation of that shape. So we get kind of a classification of which basic shape the current object mostly looks like, and how that is rotated and scaled and positioned in space. Once we have that, so we have kind of a clue about what the base geometric shape of the object is and how it's oriented in space, we feed that into an attractor dynamics approach to movement, which consists of the following behaviors: an approach behavior and an open hand behavior that makes sure that you drive your hand close to the object and opens your hand. Once you are near enough and the orientation towards the object is suitable and your hand is open, you start grasping it. So you close your fingers and detect that you've grasped it. And then again, to show that you've grasped it, you just lift it, which is the next behavior. This is actually done with similar parts that you have seen or will see today. So we have kind of the scene representation part, where we once again have the saliency pathway ending in an attention field. We have a feature value that we extract at each position, which is not now the color of the object, but a height, so that we know a useful feature of the objects and store them in those three-dimensional space feature maps, and have, of course, a connection to an attention node to go on to the next object, so on, which then gives us a height estimate for a target object, so we can always look up the height of the object here, and B, if we have focused our attention onto one place in that scene, we can use that to give kind of a sub-region of that image to our object recognition architecture. So the next part in our huge dynamic neural field model would be that object recognition and pose estimation architecture. I won't go into details because Oliver will talk about this in more detail in the next talk. What you end up here is with one kind of goal shape that best matches your shape of the object that you have in your attentional focus, while at the same time getting a scale estimate, a rotation estimate, and a translation estimate, so you get the pose of that shape. And now you can think of, okay, I have a base shape, which is 2D, I have a height of the object, so I have some knowledge about how that object looks like, which we then can use to place a grasp on that. So we have several behaviors that are executed in a serial order. So we have an open hand behavior, which detects at one point that the hand is open. And we have an approach behavior that starts moving towards the object and orients the opening of the hand towards the object, which are both precondition for that grasping behavior. And that grasping behavior just closes the fingers around the object and detects with tactile sensors that there is enough force on the fingers to say that we've grasped it. And once again, grasping it means we can now safely lift it off the table. By the way, this approach behavior takes into account the geometric shape. So if we have a round object, a cylindrical object, we don't care about orienting towards the object. We just pick one orientation because you can grasp it from any direction that you most favor. But if we have something like a block-sized object, we make sure that we pick an approach that you can really pick the sides of that cube and not some strange other configuration.
How do you say that? How do you give these?
There are okay. So for each shape that this object recognition system can say is the target shape, there is a node that activates a certain part in that dynamical system. So you set an attractor for a certain approach type. We can, I could explain that in more detail later on, but just let's finish that. So here's a typical run of those intention nodes of those 4 behaviors. So you first have those 2 competing, concurrent behaviors running, which makes sure of opening the hand to prepare the grasp. And you have the behavior that drives the hand close to the object. If both of them are finished, which happens here and here, the preconditions for that grasp behavior are fulfilled. So the grasp behavior starts taking over and starts closing the fingers and detects at that point that the force sensors, the touch sensors, detected some contact to the object, at which point the object can be lifted off the table. And how that looks like. So one nice feature of that whole huge dynamic architecture is that everything is at all times connected to the sensory input. So what we have as an emergent feature is that it can update its pose estimations while grasping. That's what you're going to see right now, hopefully. Yeah. Okay, now this is one of the objects that we use. And while it's approaching the object, I'm starting to turn around and placing it somewhere else. And you see that the orientation change and the position change are detected while it's approaching the object. So the attractor dynamics get an update in those parameters that they need to do the approach and successfully grasp the object. And the same is, of course, true for other object types. And you see that it switches over to another orientation after some point in time and then grasps it and lifts it up. Okay, so I'm really running out of time, so let's come to the conclusions. So I've talked about those 3 core behaviors that we need for change for our senior procedure architecture, which are exploration, maintenance, and query. I tried to tell you that change detection is a driving force for all those behaviors, so you can use that in several ways to detect that one of those behaviors has reached its condition of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. The integration with other DFT architectures, for example, the object recognition and some dynamic, some attractor dynamics, yields complex behaviors such as grasping. And of course, the integration was pretty easy because we all use DFT throughout our work. Yeah, that's it.